Josh's absence wasn't as bad as I thought, although Zopa worked Sanjo and me like dogs. The morning Josh headed up the mountain, he had us build a 6-foot-tall cairn out of rocks around a central flagpole for the puja blessing ceremony. We then placed smaller poles in the ground around the main pole and strung up dozens of prayer flags between them on strings. The flags came in 5 colors: red, green, yellow, blue, and white, representing the earth's 5 elements: fire, wood, earth, water, and iron. As the flags flutter in the wind, they release the prayers written on them and pacify the gods. When we finished, Josh had Sanjo and me gather gear from our team's tents and lead it against the cairn to be blessed. Zopa held the ceremony that evening for a German and Italian climbing party going up the next morning, and for our group in absentia, which he said wasn't ideal, but it sometimes worked. He recited several Buddhist prayers, then asked the mountain for permission for us to climb it in German, English, and Italian, which was impressive. The ceremony took about 3 hours, and just as it was ending, a blackbird landed on the main flagpole, which Zopa said was very auspicious. "What kind of bird was that?" I asked as we headed back to camp. "It looked kind of like a crow or a raven." Sanjo shrugged. It turned out that even Holly Angelo was right next door to me. She was relatively easy to avoid. She never left her tent before 10. I was out of mine by 7 every morning. Because there were so many people in the camp, it was easy to get lost among the tents, unless you were Holly, who wore the most garish-colored snowsuits on the slope. I could pick her out a mile away and hide. She did manage to snag me for dinner the 4th night Josh was gone. I made the mistake of heading back to my tent to drop off my ice axe before dinner. Zopa had been giving Sanjo and me self-arrest lessons, and Holly was waiting for me like a guard dog. The food was better than what they offered in the mess tent, but the atmosphere was grim. Ralph sat on his massage table with a permanent pout on his face, as if he were waiting for customers he knew would never come. Chef Pierre watched every bite of food I took and muttered about the barbaric cooking conditions at 18,000 feet. And Holly, well, my headache came back, but it wasn't from the altitude. Inside a tent, her voice was shrill enough to sour yak butter. She was no longer gasping, which I missed because the pauses gave my ears a chance to rest. I thought she was going to interview me, but it turned out that I was there to listen to her interview herself. During the 2-hour nonstop monologue, she filled me in on her life year by boring year. I didn't really start tuning in until she turned 18, but even then, it wasn't very interesting. She'd been married 3 times, and her current husband lived in Rome, and she rarely saw him. She came from a wealthy family and didn't have to work for a living. She became a journalist, as she called it, against her father's wishes because she felt it was her moral responsibility to tell the truth. I didn't mention that in the article she'd written about us, there were several things that were blatantly untrue. I also think she exaggerated her climbing conquests because when I asked her what mountains she had climbed, she said, "You know, all the big ones," and quickly changed the subject to dreams, asking if I ever have them. "Yes? Well, let me tell you about one I had just last night," she said. I hate hearing about people's dreams, but I was spared by the arrival of William Blade and 3 bodyguards the size of Yetis. In his films, William Blade had been shot, stabbed, starved, beaten, and tortured, but he'd never looked worse than when he hobbled into Holly's tent. "His back went out," one of the bodyguards explained. "We are wondering if your massage therapist can put him right." "Of course," Holly said, pushing things out of the way, including me, to make room. Ralph smiled for the first time since he'd arrived on the mountain and gleefully began laying out liniments and lotions and flexing his muscles, which weren't very impressive. I stayed long enough to watch them get Blade out of his clothes and onto the table, where he started yelling and swearing at everyone in the tent, as if they were personally responsible for his bad back. I didn't see what happened the next day. Zopa had Sanjo and me climbing a treacherous icefall outside camp, but we heard all about it when we got back that afternoon. After Ralph worked his magic on the film hero's back, Blade offered to pay him twice as much as Holly was paying to move over to his camp. Apparently, Ralph couldn't get his gear together fast enough. When Pierre saw this, he begged Blade to take him too, which he did, leaving Holly absolutely alone in her giant pink tent, screaming in rage. The bet was she was going to quit the mountain. The only person who put cash down on her staying was Zopa. He met everyone's wager with the money he had gotten from his cigarette sales. It was hours after the incident before Holly emerged from her tent. It turned out that she wasn't about to head home to her Upper East Side penthouse apartment. We were in the mess tent waiting to hear from Josh and the team up at ABC. They were supposed to leave that morning for base camp, but got pinned down by a snowstorm. We had heard that some of the people up there had HAPE, but the storm had knocked out further radio communication, so we didn't know who was sick or how bad it was. If the team wasn't able to start down the next day, the situation would turn critical. They had brought only enough food for 2 days at ABC. A couple of the Sherpas were talking about hauling up some food for them. "Not tonight," Zopa said. "The storm is moving down the mountain." The Sherpas and a small group of other climbers were arguing with Zopa about his weather prediction when Holly sauntered into the mess tent. "I'm going to the top," she announced calmly, then walked over and got a plate of food. The only person smiling was Zopa, and why not? He had just won a pot of money. Literally. The mess cook had been keeping the bets in a 10-gallon rice cooker, which was now overflowing with rupees. Sanjo had told me that if Zopa won the bet, he would give the money to the Tibetan monks. They would have to wait to get their cash. I didn't know this yet, but just like Holly, Zopa had no plans to go home anytime soon. "The snow is here," one of the Sherpas said. "That's impossible," I said. I hadn't been in the tent more than 20 minutes. When I'd walked over from HQ, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The cook pulled the flap back, and we stared outside in disbelief. The snow was so thick, I wasn't sure how I was going to find my tent. Gamoff bag. I made it as far as the HQ tent, but no further that night. The storm dumped about 4 feet of snow on base camp. It was much worse up at ABC. Josh managed to get through the radio only once during the night. It was scratchy and broken up, but we think he said there were sustained winds of 73 miles an hour and gusts of over 100. The team members were hunkered down in their tents, but there was no way for Josh to check on them because of the weather. At first light, he dug out and reported in again. "Base, we're all accounted for, but we have 2 cases of HAPE, Francis and Bill. 1 severe, 1 mild. How's the weather down there?" "Clear," the radio operator, Sparky, answered. "I just checked the meteorological maps, and there's nothing new coming in until tonight." "When?" "Storm's ETA is 1900, give or take several hours." Josh gave a harsh laugh, followed by a coughing fit. When he finally recovered, he said, "I hear you on that weather window. I'll start everyone down as soon as we can get them rehydrated. We're giving Bill extra O's and he's responding well. I think he'll be able to make it down on his own. Leah and I will follow behind him with Francis and a couple Sherpas. We'll give Bill a hand if he needs it. We're trying to get Francis into a Gamoff bag." Francis was the guy who grunted at the noodles. A Gamoff bag, pronounced Gamoff, was invented by Igor Gamoff in the late 1980s and has saved a lot of climbers from dying of HAPE. It's like an airtight body bag. At high altitudes, the air pressure is extremely low. You zip the victim inside a Gamoff bag, pump it full of air until it's about the same pressure as it would be at sea level, and bingo, the climber can breathe again, hopefully. "We'll start looking for the first climbers in about 8 hours then," Sparky said. "Be careful coming down. Avalanche risk is high. Keep us posted on the weather." "Roger." I dug my tent out of the snow, then Zopa asked Sanjo and me to dig out Holly's tent, which took us hours. She didn't help us, but she did keep us supplied with hot tea and cookies. Late that afternoon, the first of our team members started to straggle in, looking like zombies from Night of the Living Dead. It took them each 3 mugs of steaming sweet tea in the mess tent before they were finally able to put a coherent sentence together. It was a nightmare. The snow started 1,000 feet below ABC. It was so thick we had to fix a rope and tie ourselves together so we didn't lose anyone. Couldn't see a bloody thing past our eyelashes. Then it really started snowing. 22 below at ABC without the wind chill. We nearly froze to death trying to get our tents up. The guy talking gingerly pulled the glove off his right hand. 3 fingers were discolored and blistered. Krieger says I'll keep the digits, but the little toe on my left foot is going to slough off in about a week. Never liked that toe anyway. He laughed, but it wasn't a merry sound. I'd show it to you, but it would just make you sick. The blizzard wasn't the worst of it, another climber said. Not by a far sight. He was a cowboy from Abilene, Texas. An avalanche hit us at about 2 a.m. It sounded like the biggest dang stampede you ever heard. Wiped out 7 tents. Didn't lose a soul, thank the Lord, but we had to double and triple up in the remaining tents like sardines. Then the food ran out, the man with the frostbitten fingers said. Josh only had us bring enough for the trip up and back. This morning there wasn't a raisin to eat between us. We're lucky it cleared up. A couple more days and we would have starved to death. You're right about that, partner, the Texan agreed. When I crawled out this morning, I was eyeing one of them yaks with murder in my heart. Guess we should have had that dang puja ceremony before we started up the hill. Where's Josh? I asked. Him and Krieger are still hauling Francis down, the Texan drawled. They didn't leave till late, from what I hear. Turns out Francis is claustrophobic. Should have guessed it. He's always sleeping with half his head outside the tent door. He about plumb crazy when they zipped him into that bag. The only thing that saved him was that he passed out after a bit. You might be thinking that the above conversation was a little cold-hearted, and you'd be right. It was 10 below zero outside, slightly warmer in the mess tent, but not by much. When you are exhausted, having a hard time catching your breath, freezing, starving, waiting for your little toe to drop off, you have other things on your mind than the welfare of your fellow climbers. Zopa waved Sanjo and me over to him and told us to get our gear. We were going up the mountain to help Josh and Leah. Junior, Will, and Jack joined us. They'd been filming our climbing lessons with Zopa the past few days, and I wasn't sure they were coming with us to help or get footage of the Gamoff bag in action. I didn't think 1,000 feet would make that much of a difference, but at that altitude, even 100 feet made a difference. Having to plow through freshly fallen snow didn't help. About every 20 steps, I stopped, sucking in ragged breaths of freezing air. At this stage, my hope of getting to the summit, a mile and a half above where I was currently suffocating, seemed about as likely as me flying a Gamoff bag to Jupiter. My only consolation was that Sanjo and the film crew were having as much trouble as I was. The one person who wasn't affected was Zopa. He'd wait for us until we were about 50 yards behind him, then continue up the Rongbuk Glacier like a mountain goat breaking a trail. By late afternoon, there was still no sign of Josh and the others. If we didn't find them soon, we'd be searching in the dark, but even worse, clouds were starting to come in. Zopa let us catch up to him as the sun started slipping behind the mountain. Maybe they're spending the night at Camp 2 or the intermediate camp, JR suggested between gasps. There are 2 camps on the way to ABC, an intermediate camp and Camp 2, which lies 3/4 of the way up to ABC. The intermediate camp was nowhere in sight, which meant we weren't nearly as far up the mountain as it felt. And if they are not at the intermediate camp or Camp 2, Zopa asked, meaning if Josh and Dr. Krieger had passed the camps or hadn't reached them yet, they could freeze to death. Good point, JR conceded. What should we do? Zopa looked down the glacier, then squinted up at the darkening sky. A storm is coming, he said. You can get down to base camp in an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. If you leave now, you can beat it. JR gave him a skeptical look. We'd been climbing for over 4 hours now. Downhill, Zopa said by way of explanation. The trail is broken. Don't wander off it. What about you? I asked. He pulled his headlamp out of his pack and strapped it around his parka hood, then started to slip his pack back on. I know your father. He will not watch that man die. He will try to get him off the mountain. I think all of us wanted to go back down to base camp. I know I did. But none of us wanted to go down without Zopa, especially with bad weather moving in. We put on our headlamps and followed Zopa's light. 2 hours later, in the dark, with the snow beginning to fall, we spotted 2 headlamps flickering a few hundred yards above us. Josh and Leah looked completely done in. I don't think they would have made it much further on their own, and I don't know who was happier to see who. They were happy we were there to help Francis get down, and we were happy to find them because it meant we got to go down. Did you bring O's? Josh asked, kind of slurring his words. Zopa pulled an oxygen tank and mask out of his pack. Josh cranked up the regulator and handed it to Leah, who took in several deep lungfuls. Josh was next. When he finished, he offered it to us, but we all bravely shook our heads. We hadn't been up as long or as high as he and Leah, and the only reason they took hits was because they were exhausted. Climbers usually don't start sucking O's until they got to Camp 5. Zopa pointed to the bag. How is he? Alive, at least the last time we looked, but he has HAPE bad. JR pointed his headlamp at the transparent window on the top of the bag, but it was too fogged up to see inside. You still with us, Francis? Josh shouted. I thought I heard a muffled reply, but it was hard to tell in the howling wind. He's writing a message, Leah said. We stared as a feeble, backward yes appeared on the condensation on the window. Josh managed to laugh, then looked at Leah. Should we let him out? She shook her head. You're the doctor. He squatted and got closer to the bag. Help has arrived, Francis. We'll have you down to base camp soon. Soon turned out to be 4 more hours. The glacier was steep and icy. We had to place ice screws and lower the bag on ropes a few feet at a time so it didn't take off like a toboggan. We stumbled into base camp long after midnight. The camp was usually lit up like a Christmas tree with blue, red, and green tent lights, but this late, most of the climbers were asleep. We hauled the gamma bag into the aid tent and laid it on a cot. Leah pulled off her outer and inner thermal gloves with her teeth, then slowly unzipped the bag. How you feeling? She asked. Francis was the color of a corpse. He blinked his eyes open and managed to give her a weak smile. He whispered, I'm not claustrophobic anymore. Leah smiled and put a stethoscope to his chest. But you still have HAPE. I'm not going to the summit? Not this year, Josh said, looking just as disappointed as Francis. He had another opening on his climbing permit. We left Francis and Leah and went into the mess tent. A handful of the team, staff, and Sherpas were still up drinking tea and playing cards. Josh reported on Francis's condition. When he finished, he asked how Bill was. Not too good, the Texan answered. He doesn't want to go back up. Josh swore. Another climber down, and no one had climbed higher than ABC yet. The mess tent cleared out pretty fast after that, leaving me, Sanjo, Zopa, and Sparky. It felt good to drink hot tea and to breathe and have air actually fill my lungs. I felt like I was sitting in an oxygen tent, not a mess tent. Peak and Miss Angelo need to get up to ABC, Zopa said. I know, Josh said. I was going to take them and the film crew up when I got back, but I'll have to wait a few days now. I'm wiped. I'll take them all up tomorrow, Zopa offered. I couldn't even imagine walking back up the glacier in a few hours, but I couldn't protest in front of Josh or Zopa. I wished that JR, Will, and Jack hadn't headed to their tents after filming Francis being freed from the gamma bag. If they'd been there to hear Zopa's suggestion, I'm sure they would have protested for me. I can't ask you to do that, Josh said. You didn't ask me, Zopa said. I offered. They need to go up. The weather will break in a few hours. Not according to the satellite maps I just looked at, Sparky said. Zopa shrugged. The maps are wrong. What about Holly? Josh asked. I had a doctor from another camp look at her earlier today, Zopa answered. She can go. Josh grinned. So you already had this figured out before you came up to get me. Zopa ignored the comment. We will take some of the porters and yaks, he said. Resupply what we lost in the storm. There's some Sherpas I would like to visit at ABC before I leave the mountain. Did you talk to Pa Sang? Pa Sang was Josh's Sirdar, who I had seen around camp but had never officially met. He was constantly running around, yelling at the porters, arguing with Sherpas, or in the HQ tent talking to the base camp crew. He had the porters pack what was needed this afternoon, Zopa answered. Josh looked at me. You ready for 21,000 feet? I said I was, but I had some serious doubts. I hoped Zopa was wrong about the weather. ABC. The next morning, I poked my head through the tent flap. Crystal clear, 28 degrees, no wind, by far the best weather we'd had since getting to base camp, and I could not have been more disappointed. I had a sore throat, and it felt like the muscles and joints inside my skin had been replaced with broken glass. Sanjo was sitting outside waiting for me, dressed in my former clothes, including my so-called junk boots. And there was an added touch. The Peak Experience logo had been sewn on both the parka and his stocking cap. I thought Zopa had traded all that stuff away. Why was Sanjo wearing my clothes? "You do not look well," he said. "I do not feel well," I croaked back at him. "What's with the clothes?" "They didn't fit you," he answered. "Zopa gave them to me." I was too out of it to pursue it any further. I reached back into the tent for my water bottle and found it was frozen solid. I was so tired the night before I had forgotten to put it in the sleeping bag with me to keep it from freezing. I'd spent hours packing and repacking my gear for the trip up to ABC. Sanjo pulled his water bottle out of his backpack. I took a deep swig and handed it back, wondering why he had a backpack. "Are you going up to ABC with us?" "Yes," he answered, "and I would like to leave before the herders. I don't like stepping in yak dung." "Me either," I said, although I'd never seen yak dung. The porters kept yaks corralled at the far end of camp. I hadn't been over there yet, but you could sure smell the shaggy bovines when the wind blew from that direction. I wondered why Zopa hadn't mentioned Sanjo going up to ABC with us the night before, but I was too tired, hungry, and worried about the climb to ask Sanjo about it right then. "Guess we'd better try to wake up Holly." "She and Zopa have already left," Sanjo said. I looked at my watch in a panic, but it was only 9 o'clock. "When did they leave?" 2 hours ago. "Why didn't Zopa wake me up?" I asked, although I was glad for the extra sleep. "Miss Holly is a slow climber. We will overtake them." I grabbed my gear and checked it one last time. Then we went over to the mess tent to get something to eat. The only person inside was the cook. I was disappointed Josh wasn't there to see me off, but considering what he had been through the past few days, I couldn't blame him for sleeping in. Halfway through my breakfast, JR, Will, and Jack dragged in, blurry-eyed and irritable, but after half an hour of coffee and carbs, they began to perk up. "Let's get this over with," Will said, smearing glacial cream on his face to prevent it from burning. At first, it appeared that Holly was a faster climber than Sanjo thought, but her speed was explained a few hours later when we finally caught up to her near a stream of glacial meltwater. Zopa had been carrying both his and Holly's heavy backpack as they made their way up the steep glacier. Even without the backpack, she was having a hard time catching her breath. She tried to smile when she saw us, but couldn't quite manage it. Zopa looked a little haggard too, which wasn't too surprising considering he was carrying as much weight as a yak. Speaking of which, the yak herd had been gaining on us all day long and were now less than 100 yards behind. Each yak carried over 100 pounds of supplies and their own fodder. There was nothing else for them to eat this high. With a grim expression, Zopa looked at the long line of animals. "I guess he didn't want to trudge through their dung any more than we did." "Those cows are going to ruin our shots," JR said. "They're not cows, they're yaks," I said. "And how are they going to ruin your shots?" "We're filming you, not a bunch of herders and their yaks." I thought that at 19,000 feet, all my hot buttons were out of reach, but JR had just managed to punch one of them dead center. I hated television documentaries where they film the intrepid scientist, climber, or explorer in the middle of some dreadfully hostile environment all alone. Oh yeah? Then who's operating the camera as they battle the elements all alone? Back at base camp, I'd overheard climbers complaining about the filthy porters and herders and their stinking yaks. When something was missing from one of the camps, the porters and herders were always the first suspects. Sure, I didn't want to step in yak dung, but it was pretty humbling to hear those same herders and porters in their cheap boots, ratty clothes, and heavy packs coming up behind us with the strength and breath to whistle, chant, and sing as they hauled our gear up the mountain. None of us were whistling and singing, and we were carrying a tenth of what they had on their backs. Without those herders, yaks, and porters, we wouldn't be here, I said to JR. Leaving them out of the film is like leaving Everest out of the film. They're more important to a climber getting to the summit than the climber. I didn't have enough breath for any more, but I think I made my point because Zopa laughed long and hard, which is hard to do at that altitude. And when the yaks and herders and porters reached us, JR filmed the entire procession crossing the stream, including the bloody spots in the snow left by the yaks that had cut their hooves on sharp rocks. We gladly followed their dung trail all the way up to the intermediate camp. The camp wasn't exactly what I expected. It was located at the very edge of an unstable cliff above a roaring glacial river. Behind us was a slope that looked like it was going to come tumbling down on top of us. I pointed out these two potential disasters to Zopa, and as an exclamation mark, a boulder popped loose and came tumbling down the slope, sliding to a stop about 50 feet from where we were standing. "It's level," Zopa said, as if a comfortable sleep were all that mattered before we were crushed to death. I looked around at the others. None of them seemed to be bothered, but that might have been because they were so exhausted they could barely move. I knew exactly how they felt. The simplest tasks seemed to take forever, and we weren't even up to ABC yet. There were 3 higher camps above that. After setting up our tent, Sanjo and I had decided to bunk together so we didn't have to carry up an extra tent. We set up Holly's. She hadn't uttered a single word since we'd caught up to her. She was sitting slumped on a flat rock that looked like a puppet with its strings cut, watching us through dull, lifeless eyes. Sanjo went to help Zopa and the other Sherpas get dinner ready, and I walked over and asked Holly how she was doing. She took several deep breaths and on the last exhale managed a wheezy, "Fine." At sea level, anyone who looked like she did would be in the back of an ambulance on their way to emergency. But at 19,028 feet, the emergency threshold was proportionately higher. Even so, I didn't like Holly's chances for getting any further up the mountain in the condition she was in. A shot of O's would perk her right up, but it would also defeat the purpose of acclimatization. Her body was actually climbing as she was slumped on that cold rock, which was the whole purpose of climb high, sleep low. Red blood cells are multiplying by the millions to protect our bodies from the thin air. These new red cells stick around during the rest periods at lower altitudes, making it easier the next time you go up. So even though, "Shut up, Peak," Holly managed to say with a small smile. "What?" "I know." Gasp. "How?" Gasp. "Red blood cells." Gasp. "Work." I stared at her completely dumbfounded until I realized that somewhere in the middle of my thoughts I had started talking out loud without realizing it, which should give you some idea of what kind of shape I was in. "Sorry," Holly nodded. "Help me to my tent." When I got her up, she swayed, but a couple of shallow breaths steadied her. It took us a good 5 minutes to walk the 15 feet to the tent. By the time we got there, we were both gasping. It felt like somebody had cut my strings. What was happening to me? Holly nodded. "Help me to my tent." When I got her up, she swayed, but a couple of shallow breaths steadied her. It took us a good 5 minutes to walk the 15 feet to the tent, and by the time we got there, we were both gasping. It felt like somebody had cut my strings. What was happening to me? I deposited Holly in her tent, then slowly made my way over to Sanjo and Zopa, wondering if I was going to make it there without collapsing. Zopa handed me a cup. I took it from him, but I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with it. "Drink," he said. "Oh yeah," I thought sluggishly. "A cup. You drink from it." That first sip flowed down my esophagus and hit my belly like some kind of magic elixir. "What is this stuff?" Zopa stared at me. "Tea," he said, "with sugar." "What kind of tea?" "Plain old green tea." He reached out into his inside pocket of my Gore-Tex coat, pulled out my water bottle and shook it. It was nearly full. "Dehydration," he said. "You are not drinking enough. This will kill you faster than the thin air." He nodded toward Sanjo, who also had his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Sanjo is guilty too." I hadn't felt thirsty all day, but I knew Zopa was right. If you waited to drink until you were thirsty at this altitude, it might be too late. "Holly," I said with alarm, thinking she was suffering from dehydration too. Zopa shook his head. "Miss Holly has had plenty of fluids," he said. "I made certain." She's not doing well, I said. I have seen worse, Zopa said, and some of those made it to the summit. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. I had a miserable night. I went a little overboard on my hydration and had to get up 3 times to pee. Then it seemed that every time I started to doze off, a boulder from the slope let loose, causing me to sit up in terror as I waited for it to crush us. But the worst problem was my throat. By morning, it felt like I had a hard-boiled goose egg lodged in it. With all my tossing and turning and peeing, I don't imagine that Sunjo got much sleep either, but he didn't complain. On a brighter note, the morning was as mild as the previous morning, and Holly was much improved. She managed to walk to the mess tent to have breakfast with us. The night before, Zopa had served her dinner in her tent. The herders and yaks left an hour before we did. They would go straight up to ABC without stopping at Camp 2, which should give you some idea of the kind of shape they were in compared to us. JR came up as I was packing the tent and said he wanted to do an interview with me before we headed up. Sunjo and Zopa were packing up Holly's gear. I'd already done several of these interviews down at base camp, and I dreaded doing any more. I discovered that a camera in my face and a microphone boom dangling above my head turned me into a babbling idiot. Just act natural, JR would say. Be yourself. Right. Then he would give me little prompts like, what's it feel like to be up on the world's greatest mountain with your dad? Or how does being up on Everest compare to climbing skyscrapers? I would try to answer the questions with straightforward honesty and end up spewing forth the most incredibly lame answers imaginable. I stopped packing and joined the crew, trying not to look too glum. They had positioned the camera in front of the rotting slope, and I was up all night listening to the slope belch boulders. Will made me squat, pulled the hood off my head so they could see my face, and wiped off all my glacial cream, which I had carefully applied. Man, wouldn't it be great if one of those big boulders just let loose while we were doing this? Jack said. He was the sound guy and was always hoping that something horrible would happen when the film was rolling. Okay, JR said, we're going to keep it real simple today. I just want you to repeat what you said yesterday about the yaks and porters. That was really poignant, and you were absolutely right. I don't know if they'll let us use it in the final version, but they sure ought to. I was thrilled. In fact, during my sleepless night, I had thought about what I had said and wished they'd had the camera rolling. JR gave the cue. On 3, 2, 1, tape rolling. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. We're rolling, JR said impatiently. The camera batteries didn't last very long in cold weather. I tried again, but nothing came out. Anytime, Peak. A boulder's coming loose, Jack said excitedly. Come on, Peak. I pointed to my mouth and shook my head. My voice was gone. JR swore. That boulder's ready to pop, Jack said. I think it's going to miss us, but it'll definitely be in the frame. Zopa, JR yelled. Can you come over for a little stand-up? Zopa shook his head and pointed at Sunjo. Let Sunjo do it. Get out of the frame, Peak, JR shouted. I moved and Sunjo quickly stepped into my place. We're still rolling, JR said. Talk about your feelings toward the mountain, Sunjo. Maybe something about your father. On 3, 2, 1. My father came to Sagarmatha when he was my age, Sunjo said in his cool accent. He started as a porter and worked his way up to become a Sherpa and an assistant Sirdar. He told me that he climbed mountains so I would not have to, but I think there was more to it than this. The boulder Jack hoped would fall did, along with a ton of other debris. Sunjo did not flinch or even glance behind him at the mini avalanche. He just kept talking, and JR kept filming. My father was a stranger to me, but here on the mountain, I am getting to know him through the conversations of the Sherpas and climbers and porters. I came here to see the mountain, but what I'm discovering is my father. Beautiful, JR said. It was beautiful, and I hate to admit it, but I was a little jealous of Sunjo's smooth performance. Unlike me, he was totally comfortable in front of the video camera. JR had never praised me after a taping. Of course, I was lousy at it, but still. Jack and Will were patting Sunjo on the back, telling him what a natural he was. I walked back to our tent and finished packing. I don't think they realized I had left. At mid-morning, the weather turned, with gray clouds coming in from the west and a bitterly cold wind blowing down the mountain. We had to stop and put on more layers of clothes. I covered my face with a silk balaclava and wool scarf. My throat was no better, but I trudged on, one step at a time, stopping every half hour, unwinding my shroud to drink, and gagging on every gulp. Zopa walked behind us, still carrying Holly's load, and gently coaxing her up the slope as if he were her personal Sherpa or something. I didn't know if she had hired him or promised to give money to the Tibetan monks or if it was something else. But without him, she would have been going downhill instead of up. It took us 8 hours, half a mile or so, to get to Camp 2. There were so many climbers, we barely had room to pitch our tents. Some of the climbers were coming down from Camp 4 above ABC. Some were on their way up to ABC, and some were using the site as their base camp, which was hard to imagine because I could barely breathe. The film crew had to set up their tents on the far side of the camp from us. The camp was at the junction of 2 glaciers, East Rongbuk and Bifeng. You couldn't see the Everest summit from the camp, but there was a spectacular view of 3 other Himalayan peaks, Changtse, Changzheng, and Lixin. There wasn't enough room to set up the mess tent, so we were on our own for dinner. I got the stove going while Sanjo walked down to a glacial pond to get water. By the time he got back, it had started snowing. We put the water on the stove and waited for it to boil, which was taking longer and longer the higher we climbed. I wasn't hungry, and I don't think Sanjo was either, but we both knew we had to eat. Sanjo asked me how I was doing. I tried to answer, but all that came out was a hissing croak. It didn't bother me that I couldn't talk. What worried me more was that the sore throat might be the beginning of something worse. There was a nasty virus going through base camp that had everyone in an uproar. If you catch something bad enough, your climb is over. As a result, the teams had circled the wagons by staying in their own camps and suspiciously eyeing the approach of other climbers as if they were plague carriers. Typically, one of the porters was accused of bringing the virus to camp, as if the climbers were incapable of carrying a virus to Everest. As we waited for the water to boil, we watched Zopa set up Holly's tent, which she crawled into as soon as it was up. But then he put up his own tent and started making their dinner. I was talking to one of the other climbers, Sanjo said. He told me that tomorrow will be a big test. He's been up to ABC and has spent 1 night at Camp 4. He said if we make it that far, we should be able to make it to the summit. I should have been paying more attention to what Sanjo was saying, but at that moment I was having a minor crisis that had nothing to do with my sore throat. What was causing the meltdown was the fact that it had been a relatively easy day, but I was a complete wreck. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. Zopa's words had been echoing in my brain all day, and I was betting that Peak Marcello was in the not crowd, right beside George with the clogged heart and Francis of the Gammoth bag. Dr. Wu had been wrong about my conditioning, or else I had screwed myself up by getting dehydrated. But if that was the case, why wasn't Sanjo suffering? I looked over at him. He was stirring a pot, chattering away like we were camped on a beach. The next morning, Zopa dragged us out of our tent before dawn. There was about 1 foot of new snow on the ground, but it had stopped falling. "Hard climb today," he said, "and we need to get up fast or there won't be a place to pitch our tents. How's your throat?" I shook my head. My voice was still gone, but I didn't feel any worse than I had the night before, which I considered a victory. Outside camp, we started up the trough, a depression that sits between 2 rows of jagged ice pinnacles that looked like giant canine teeth. The main path was well worn and clearly marked by the axe. Zopa warned us to stay on the path. If you wander off, even to take a pee, you could be lost forever in the ice maze. I promise this is the last time I'm going to talk about high-altitude bodily functions. Answering a call of nature on the mountain is a huge ordeal because at that altitude, you can't do anything fast, and you have to take off layer after layer of clothing. It can delay your climb by a half hour or more, which can ruin your chances of getting higher because bad weather moves in so quickly. This is why you try to take care of all of this before you leave camp. About noon, we ran into the porters, yaks, and herders heading back down to base camp. They were still whistling and singing, and I was tempted to get in line with them. I think the only thing that stopped me was that Holly had been in front of me all day long, and I wasn't about to let her get any higher up the mountain than me. 2 hours later, we got our first look at ABC. Sanjo pointed out the tiny colored tents in the distance, but the camp wasn't as close as it looked. It was 3 more torturous hours away. The only bright spot was that Sanjo and I managed to pass Holly and Zopa about 100 yards before they reached the camp. ABC, 21,161 feet, higher than Kilimanjaro and Mount McKinley, and I felt it. The crude camp made every other place we had stayed seem like paradise. It was situated on a pile of rubble between a glacier that looked like it had been formed by frozen sewage and a rotten rock wall. The ground was littered with ankle-breaking rocks and life-ending crevasses. JR filmed our triumphant arrival. I barely had the strength even to look at the camera as I trudged by it. There were only about 6 tents set up, so there was plenty of room for us to stake out an area for the team. Unlike at base camp, people weren't wandering around socializing. They were either too pooped to move or terrified about twisting something this close to the top. By the time Zopa and Holly arrived, we had our tents set up and a fire going from the wood the porters had left. "How's your throat?" Holly asked. Sanjo and I nearly fell off the rocks we were sitting on. This was the first full sentence she had put together since we left base camp, and her voice almost sounded normal. We had passed her, but she seemed to be in better shape than we were. "It's still sore," I said with difficulty. "I think there's a doctor up here," she said. "I'll go find him." By the time we had her tent up, she was back with the doctor in tow. He looked like he needed a doctor himself, but he examined my throat, then called Leah Krieger down at base camp. They decided to put me on antibiotics. Josh came on the radio and asked me how it was going. I couldn't answer, so I turned over the radio to Holly, who gave a glowing report. Josh said they were heading up to ABC, then to Camp 4 for a night, and would no doubt see us on our way down. I should mention something about the radios here. The frequencies were wide open, and people had nothing better to do than sit in their tents and monitor the chatter. This included Captain Scheck and the soldiers. As a result, everyone was careful about what they talked about, especially expedition leaders like Josh. The next day was basically spent lying in our tents trying to breathe, hoping that our red blood cells were doing what they were supposed to be doing. When we moved, it was in slow motion, like we were on the moon. You'd get a plate of food and stare at it, thinking a couple minutes had passed, and tell yourself you should try to eat before it cooled off. Fork to mouth, ice cold. Huh? Look at watch. Half an hour? How? By the morning we left, the antibiotics had kicked in and my throat was better. I even managed to croak out a couple of understandable sentences. Sanjo, on the other hand, wasn't feeling good. He had spent a good deal of the night vomiting outside our tent door. Every time he puked, Zopa would come over and make him drink, worried about dehydration. I felt bad for him, but to be honest, his getting sick perked me up a little. Terrible, I know. I felt better knowing that I wasn't the only one having a difficult time. The 3-day trip up took us 9 hours to complete on the way down. We ran into Josh between the first and second camps. He asked how my throat was, then continued toward ABC, shouting down at us that he would see us in a few days. Holly not only carried her own backpack on the way down, she beat us to base camp by half an hour. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. Letters from home. That first night back in base camp, I slept for 15 hours. When I finally woke up, I felt as good as I have ever felt in my entire life. I could have easily gone out for an 18,044-foot jog, but instead I walked to the mess tent and ate about 9 pounds of food. Dr. Krieger came in and watched me wolf down my last plate, then took me over to the aid tent to look at my throat. She said that it was better, but I needed to keep taking the antibiotics for the next week to make sure it went away. My next stop was HQ, where they congratulated me on making it to ABC and gave me a packet of letters from home. There was a card from Rolf, 2 letters from Mom, and 5 thick letters from Paula and Patrice. The envelopes were crumpled and smeared with dirt and grease. I looked at the postmarks. The mail had been sent to Josh's office in Chiang Mai, forwarded to Kathmandu, and from there, no doubt, thrown into a truck headed to the mountain. Thin air mail. Getting the letters caused my good mood to tank. I hadn't spent 1 minute thinking about my family since I'd arrived at base camp, and I felt a little guilty. But what really bothered me was that the letters had arrived at base camp in the first place. This meant that some of my letters I had sent to my father when I was a kid probably had arrived too. He had gone into a tent at some high-altitude camp just like this and come out with a stack of letters, which included a letter from his son. I was so mad I wanted to run up to ABC and punch him in the goggles. Instead, I decided to finish Moleskin number 1, which you are reading, and send it to my mom, kind of like a long letter. I was not going to ignore my family the same way that Josh had ignored me, and it would fulfill my requirement for Vincent at GSS. The next morning, I went to the mess tent to get something to eat before getting back to the Moleskin. Sanjo wasn't there. Boy, very sick, the cook told me. I took a thermos of hot tea, over to Sanjo's tent. He was cocooned in his sleeping bag like a caterpillar larva, with only his stocking-capped head sticking out. "You shouldn't be here," he croaked, but I could tell he was happy to see me. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot, and maybe it was the dim light coming through the blue nylon tent, but he looked like he had lost 10 pounds since I last saw him. I poured him a cup of tea. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated. "Forget it," I said. "You and I have been swapping germs for weeks. I'm immune." I put the cup to his lips, hoping I was right. "I will be better in a few days." Looking at him, that was hard to believe, but I said I was sure he was right. I stopped by the aid tent. I wasn't sure if Dr. Krieger's duties included treating kitchen help, but if they didn't, I was going to talk her into it. She was tapping away on her laptop, but stopped when I came in. "How are you feeling today?" "Fine, but I'm worried about Sanjo." She made me open my mouth and shone a light down my throat. "Inflammation's almost gone," she said, clicking off the light. "But you need to keep taking those antibiotics, especially if you insist on visiting sick people in their tents." "So you've seen him?" I said. "Last night and this morning. And he's sick, but he'll live." I spent the next 2 days writing and managed to finish the first Moleskin on the day Josh was to return from ABC and Camp 4. When I got to the end of the notebook, I wrote letters to Paula and Patrice thanking them for the artwork they had sent and telling them how I had pinned it up in my tent, so it was the first thing I saw in the morning and the last thing I saw at night. I told them that I missed them so bad I was thinking about rustling a yak and riding it back to New York. Last, I wrote to Rolf. He had sent me a card with a photo of King Kong climbing the Empire State Building. Inside were 3 $100 bills and a handwritten note. "Hang in there, Peak. I miss you. I want you home. Love, Rolf." Not we. I miss you. I want you home. With these 2 sentences, he had done for me more than Josh had ever done or could ever do. I went over to HQ and addressed the envelopes. Sparky told me the mail would go out the following morning. When Josh arrived later that afternoon, I didn't tell him about the Moleskin or the letters. He didn't deserve to know.